It's a good afternoon. Welcome to Asake Online. My name is Zenzele Ndebele. This is the public lecture series that we normally hold at least once a month for the last 3 months or so, where we invite different guests to talk about different topics that are normally to do with our politics, our history, and it's a way to re-educate ourselves about the history of Zimbabwe, learn other things that we have not known, and also discover new things. The problem with our Zimbabwean history is that history is always written by the victors, and sometimes some people are completely written out of history. So you never hear stories about some people who participated in the liberation struggle. You never hear stories of other gallant sons and daughters of the soil who were also in the front to liberate Zimbabwe. And it is our duty as young people to go out, talk to the people, complete the puzzle, ask where we don't understand. So this is the idea behind the issue of the public series to actually understand most of the topics in greater detail. And today, my guest on this public lecture, the person who is going to give us the public lecture is none other than Jeremy Brickhill. I'm sure some of you have heard the name, some of you have interacted with him. Jeremy Brickhill was born in Zimbabwe, and he actually went to school at the Rhodes Estate Preparatory School, known as REPS in Matopo, before completing his secondary school at Mount Pleasant. It's now called the Joshua Mkomo School in Harare. He then left the country to avoid military conscription into the Rhodesian Army. This was around 1974. During that time, he joined the ZAPU, or he volunteered and joined the ZAPU, where he then served he volunteered to actually serve in ZIPRA. When he joined ZIPRA, he was deployed in the National Security Organization known as NSO. If I'm not mistaken, this was the intelligence with the ZIPRA intelligence, or the ZAPU intelligence, depending who you are talking to. And I hope he's going to give us the background to NSO and how it related to ZIPRA and to ZAPU. So he served in the intelligence directorate of the NSO under the late Victor Mlambo. Later on, he was promoted into the high command and headed the new directorate in the NSO, established to support the 0 hour operation. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about 0 hour, and I hope today we're going to get a better understanding of what 0 hour was all about. At independence, of course, he was demobilized, and he was involved in assisting ex-combatants attempting to establish a cooperative ventures. And he became a leading figure in the organization of collective cooperatives in Zimbabwe. This was established by both the ZIPRA and the ZANLA combatants, the war veterans in the early 80s. He played a significant but secret role in supporting ANC and Umkhonto weSizwe operations from Zimbabwe, and was recently, a year or two ago, I think it's 2 years ago, identified by Dumiso Tawengwa as having been the ZIPRA commander responsible for assisting MK in the successful attack on the Kobe nuclear reactor in Cape Town in December 1982. In 1987, he was a victim of an assassination attempt by the apartheid regime death squad in Harare, and he sustained serious injuries. He was very close to Dumiso Tawengwa, and he worked with some progressive forces within ZAPU and ZANU as well. And he was also appointed in 2010, he was appointed the executive director of the Zimbabwe Peace and Security Program. So these are some of the highlights about the person who's going to talk to us today. He has been involved in international peace. He has worked in many countries, in Darfur, in Somalia, Northern Ireland, Colombia, Ukraine. He has also assisted in establishing international peace, international security mediation training, and he has worked with the UN and other bodies. So he's not new in the politics, as well as in the security sector. But above all, today he's going to be giving us a presentation on ZIPRA, the People's Army. And at this moment in time, I would like to invite or welcome our guest, Jeremy Brickhill. Good afternoon, Jeremy.
Good afternoon, Zenzele, and Thank you very much for the invitation. My congratulations, firstly, to you and your comrades at CITI, who are doing such a wonderful job in recovering the hidden and stolen and lost history of our struggle for liberation and freedom. May I begin by asking all of you who are here to observe a moment's silence to commemorate all those who have sacrificed their lives in our long struggle for freedom, justice, and democracy. Thank you. My subject today is ZIPRA, the People's Army, and that gives me an opportunity to make a personal introductory comment because I served in this People's Army myself. As Zenzele mentioned, I left the country in 1974 to join the struggle. He's given a very extensive biography of where I served. I served in NSO. NSO was headed by Dumiso Debengwa, and I headed the Special Operations Division of the Intelligence Directorate under Victor Mlambo. I'm sometimes asked what it was like to serve in a black guerrilla army, or even an Ndebele army. And my answer is that I didn't actually serve in a black guerrilla army. I served in a people's army. We were called the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, and that is what we were. We were a People's Revolutionary Army. We thoroughly deserve our place in the history of liberation in Zimbabwe. We also deserve a place uniquely in the history of African liberation armies across the continent. As I'm going to demonstrate in this presentation, ZIPRA, uniquely amongst all liberation armies on the continent, attempted to build a military force capable of achieving a military victory over settler colonialism and seizing state power. No other liberation movement on our continent attempted this challenging mission. And I think for this reason, ZIPRA thoroughly deserves its place in African liberation history. I'd like to begin by quoting something that the late Commander Dumiso Debengwa said on the subject of Zimbabwe's official history. Quote, "Our official history is a mythical narrative about leaders. This mythical history does not recognize or record the deeds of simple liberation fighters. Our official history does not recognize the role of ZIPRA. Our official history is not intended to be history. It is intended to perpetuate myths which project certain individuals and keep them at the center of the stage. Our official history cannot face inconvenient truths, and that is because the truth reminds us of the non-racial, free and democratic Zimbabwe we still have to achieve. But the truth has long legs, and in the end, it will outrun the short-legged lies and win the race. But this will only happen if we continue to tell the truth about our history." My subject today is the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, which was only established in 1971, almost a full decade after ZAPU commenced armed actions. Depending on your point of view, ZIPRA ceased to exist either on 19th of April, 1980, following independence, when it effectively lost its independent command, or more realistically, perhaps in May 1981, when disarmament of ZIPRA forces was completed. I will therefore focus on the period 1971 to 1981, the decade in which ZIPRA existed as an organization. But before I tackle the ZIPRA history of 1971 to 1981 itself, I do have to address some of the pre-ZIPRA history to provide some background to the development of the armed struggle by ZAPU, and to refute some of the myths about the armed struggle which have been propagated over very many years. Among these myths is the long-standing claim that those who split away from ZAPU to form ZANU in 1963 did so because they were the radicals who wanted armed struggle, and those who remained in ZAPU were those opposed to or fearful of armed struggle. This is simply not true. So here are some facts about the turn to armed struggle. Firstly, the turn towards violent resistance on the part of militant nationalists was a process, not an event. And it was a complex process, which we can't address in detail today. But that process should include reference to a series of increasingly fierce clashes with the Rhodesian security forces, starting possibly with the miners' strike at Wankie Colliery in 1954, the bus boycotts in Salisbury in 1956, which led to the declaration of a state of emergency, and very importantly, the G uprising, which started in Bulawayo in 1959. These events, in which attempts at peaceful protest were ruthlessly and violently suppressed, led sections of the nationalist movement, especially the youth, to conclude that they had to fight back. And this is indeed what happened. But it didn't happen all at once. It happened as an incremental process in which the early resistors, armed only with stones and petrol bombs, began a physical confrontation with settler colonialism. This process, essentially starting with the G uprising in 1959 and continuing in the early 1960s, led towards the actual armed liberation struggle in which the liberation movement was finally able to face the colonizers armed with modern weapons of war themselves. A leaflet distributed in the townships during the G period under the pseudonym General Hokoyo called on the militant youths to form secret underground cells and to attack the authorities using homemade weapons like petrol bombs, stones, and dynamite stolen from mines. These underground structures, about which very little has been written or said, were called janda, after gendarmes in the Congo at the time. And later, in Bulawayo townships, they operated under the name the Formidables. They attacked police stations, police vehicles, administration buildings. And as this violent resistance spread into rural areas, attacks also took place on rural administration buildings and even dip tanks across the whole country. These early underground cells, which essentially started the organized violent resistance to colonialism, also provided very important experience and knowledge of how to build secret underground party structures, and enabled ZAPU to sustain secret party support for the armed struggle throughout the following 2 decades after the party was banned. The survival and role of the underground ZAPU party structures is a very important factor and was a major factor in the conduct of the armed struggle by ZIPRA in later years, as I will demonstrate shortly. So ZANU was formed in 1963. These secret underground cells I have been describing took the first real steps towards violent confrontation with the settler system well before the launch of ZANU, and the battles they waged took place under the direction of the National Democratic Party and then its successor ZAPU. The first weapons of war arrived in the country before the formation of ZANU, and the first volunteers for military training left the country before the formation of ZANU. The first weapons were actually smuggled out of Egypt in late 1962, actually by Dr. Nkomo himself, and they were brought into the country by a series of comrades. The first handful of volunteers left the country for training in Ghana, and then later China, Egypt, North Korea, and Cuba in early '63. These early steps were undertaken by ZAPU under the leadership of the Special Affairs Department, headed by James Chikaremba. So it's nonsense to say that ZANU was formed to enable an armed struggle to commence. The NDP and then ZAPU started preparations for armed struggle well before ZANU was formed. A second myth of this sort is the claim that the first armed confrontation in Rhodesia took place at the Battle of Chinoy in 1966. This is also false. The first armed attack was actually carried out by a small ZAPU Special Affairs unit under the command of Comrade Moffat Khadebi on the 22nd of September 1964. This was an armed attack on the homestead of a magistrate who had issued and signed detention orders against many of the nationalist leaders. The unit led by Comrade Moffat Khadebi, who is still alive today, was one of several trained units that had already been deployed into the country by ZAPU to carry out reconnaissance and preparations for armed struggle. In early 1965, and following the return to Zambia from military training of several groups of the second echelon of trainees who had traveled to the Soviet Union and Cuba, at that time, the Special Affairs Department convened a series of discussions on the way forward. Resolutions were adopted at these meetings, creating the armed wing of ZAPU. or the ZAPU army, with its own command structure. It was this new ZAPU army which began preparations to launch the first guerrilla operations into Zimbabwe. Following the establishment of the ZAPU army in 1965, small guerrilla units of 2 to 3 men each were infiltrated into the country to support the sabotage campaign still being waged by the Janda groups and to carry out various reconnaissance missions. These units also ferried weapons into the country and undertook some local training of Janda members. Similar but slightly larger units were introduced into the country in 1966, including the reconnaissance unit in which Comrade Chinga Dube and other comrades undertook the preparations for the major infiltration by the Lutuli detachment the following year. The first large-scale guerrilla military operations in Zimbabwe were conducted by the ZAPU army in 1967 and 68 and involved 2 major incursions by over 250 trained guerrillas. The Lutuli detachment, which entered the country through Wankie in the northwest, and the Pyramid detachment operating through Sipalilo in the northeast. These operations were conducted by ZAPU and the ANC of South Africa Umkhonto weSizwe guerrillas in joint units as part of a military alliance which had been established between ZAPU and the ANC of South Africa. By the way, Comrade Moffat Khadebi, who had already fired the first shots in the armed struggle in 1964, commanded the Pyramid detachment in Sipalilo. These pioneering operations by the ZAPU army have been neglected or been subject to distortion in the official history of the armed struggle in Zimbabwe. But in reality, they represent the actual commencement of significant armed struggle in Zimbabwe. There are numerous other such myths and distortions of the history of the armed liberation struggle, many of which relate to the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army and its composition, development, conduct, and strategy. It's a shameful matter of public record that the ZIPRA archives, which were confiscated by the ZANU government shortly after independence, have never been returned or made available through the National Archives for the benefit of future generations. Equally regrettable is the fact that post-independence generations have been force-fed a historical narrative, which, as Comrade Dabengwa noted, is simply aimed at perpetuating myths and projecting certain individuals and promoting a simplistic, distorted, and one-sided account of the very complex and multifaceted nature of our liberation history. The official liberation history book taught in our schools, The Struggle for Zimbabwe by Martin and Johnson, is, in my view, a disgraceful travesty containing the most dreadful and utterly shameless distortions and falsehoods. Fortunately, published accounts by comrades who actually participated in the liberation struggle from both ZIPRA and ZANLA have increased in number in recent years, and they offer a more realistic and honest account of the liberation war. However, these publications tend to have very limited distribution and are not easily accessible to the general public. Among our own historians, Prof. Bebe, Patisa Nyati, and others have made very significant contributions to recording and analyzing the history of ZAPU and ZIPRA. And international historians such as Jocelyn Alexander and the late Terence Ranger have also made important contributions. But much remains to be done, and historians still have a very big and important task to accomplish in assessing our liberation history from an honest and objective viewpoint to produce an accurate and meaningful historical record. I hope to make a small contribution to this important process today in this presentation. History should, of course, comprise various perspectives, and this presentation is, of course, my own personal recollection of events and my own personal interpretation. So let me now turn directly to the actual topic, entitled ZIPRA, the People's Army. In the time available for this presentation today, I want to focus on 3 major aspects of ZIPRA history, which relate most directly to the notion of a people's army. The first concerns the relationship between the political party, ZAPU, and ZIPRA and the people, and this relationship, how this relationship determined the conduct of ZIPRA forces during the Liberation War. The second issue will concern the actual composition and development of ZIPRA. And the third component will focus on the military strategy of ZIPRA and how this strategy was intended to achieve genuine independence and the transfer of power to the people. Finally, before I begin, let me make a small comment about my sources. In addition to my own personal knowledge as a former ZIPRA NSO officer and various published sources on ZIPRA history, I also make reference to a number of interviews conducted in 1981 and to the results of a questionnaire survey carried out in ZIPRA assembly points as part of the ZIPRA history project at the same time. These materials have previously been cited in Chapter 3 of Soldiers in Zimbabwe's Liberation War, Volume 1, edited by Ngwabe Bebe and Terence Ranger. So let me begin with the first component, the party, the army, and the people. When referring to the liberation forces in Zimbabwe, many commentators and even serious academics often make sweeping generalizations which suggest a uniformity which falsely overemphasizes some of the common characteristics of both ZANLA and ZIPRA, making little or no attempt to differentiate the composition and conduct of these two armed forces, or to note how they changed and developed over time. This Vakomana characterization is not only historically inaccurate, but it also obscures and distorts important features of the Liberation War and the manner in which it was conducted. Liberation armies are usually young armies. Often they are armies of teenagers. In Africa, guerrilla armies have been young and predominantly peasant armies. Both ZIPRA and ZANLA broadly shared these characteristics, but as I will demonstrate shortly, even in this regard, there were important differences. The first and most significant differentiation we should make between the two armies concerns the role played by the political parties which claimed their allegiance. ZIPRA and ZANLA were in fact two very different military organizations, and one of the major differences between them was that ZIPRA operated in parallel with and under the authority of a well-established underground political party, ZAPU, which had functional provincial district and local branch structures in many urban and rural areas and in exile throughout the war. ZANU, for the most part, did not have these local party structures, and ZANLA forces therefore related to local communities directly, whereas ZIPRA interacted with the local population through organized party branches. This had major consequences for both civilians and armed fighters, and specifically impacted on the relationships between fighters and civilians in different contexts. I have already alluded to the important role played by underground structures created by ZAPU in the early 1960s, the Janda and the other secret party cells which carried out sabotage and supported the first small guerrilla units of the ZAPU army. By the time ZIPRA was formed in 1971, ZAPU had been banned for several years. And by the peak recruitment year for ZIPRA, which was 1977, the party had been banned and suppressed for almost a decade and a half. Nevertheless, and surprisingly, 60% of ZIPRA recruits had been members of functioning ZAPU or ZAPU Youth League branches before they left the country. Almost 70% of ZIPRA recruits came from families in which one or both parents were members of underground party branches. These statistics obtained from the questionnaire survey I mentioned previously illustrate the major role played by the political party ZAPU, not only in the recruitment of ZIPRA fighters, but as we shall see, in the manner in which ZIPRA conducted the Liberation War. ZAPU underground party branches existed and survived in many parts of the country throughout the Liberation War, despite continuous repression, arrests, and detention of officials, activists, and members. ZANU did not have such structures inside the country. The survival and active engagement in the armed liberation struggle of ZAPU and its underground party branches and structures is certainly the most significant factor in understanding the important differences in the conduct of ZANLA and ZIPRA with regard to the civilian population. The majority of ZIPRA recruits came from communities in which local underground ZAPU political structures were functioning, and therefore they had direct, local and personal experience of the leading role of a political party. The majority of ZIPRA recruits had been members of underground party structures before they left to join the armed struggle, and therefore they had experience of political organization and activism, both in resistance to the settler regime, but also in support of the armed struggle itself. The majority of ZIPRA recruits were either recruited by party structures directly, or having volunteered were assisted to leave the country by party structures. Less than 15% of ZIPRA recruits were recruited directly by ZIPRA forces. These political influences meant that most ZIPRA recruits had significant experience of the role of the political party and of political organization itself before they went on to receive formal political education from ZIPRA commissars and military training from instructors. Such recruits brought with them a level of political experience and maturity not commonly found in African liberation armies, and certainly not by ZANLA recruits, who did not have this experience of a political party and organization before they left the country. The fact that ZANU branches as such did not exist in the same way that ZAPU underground political structures existed throughout the Liberation War impacted not only on recruitment processes, but also on relations with local communities and on the conduct of liberation forces. With regard to local communities, ZIPRA relied primarily on existing party structures for support. Food, medical supplies, transport, and intelligence information was provided to fighters by existing local underground party structures. When ZIPRA forces were about to enter a new operational area, it was customary for the ZIPRA commissar and or the intelligence officer to seek out local underground party contacts before forces were deployed into that area. If no underground party branch existed, the commissar would seek out local party members and encourage them to re-establish clandestine party branches to prepare to receive and support the fighters. ZIPRA forces thus interacted with the local population through a structured political relationship. The commissars oversaw this relationship, but ZIPRA logistics officers, security and intelligence officers, and later training instructors all sought to develop their relationship with specific civilian party officials responsible for particular functions in the civilian population. This had several important implications. Firstly, as many of the organizing, mobilizing, and logistical tasks of the war were being carried out by the civilian underground political party branches, the fighters could concentrate on their military tasks. Thus, ZIPRA generally required far smaller numbers of fighters to effectively cover an area. And in many ways, they imposed a much lighter burden on the local population. Secondly, and as a rule, ZIPRA fighters did not need to carry out political education or mobilization, which was already being conducted by the civilian party structures. This had a major impact on the ZIPRA interaction with the local population. ZIPRA did not need to hold pungwis with the local population, as ZANLA did. And in general, ZIPRA did not involve itself in imposing discipline on local communities, except in very serious circumstances. As one ZIPRA regional commander put it to me, as far as controlling the local people was concerned, we left that to civilians. The role of Mujibas differed too. In ZIPRA, this role was largely carried out through specific youth league structures of the party and operated within a civilian party framework under the authority of the elder party officials of ZAPU itself. Thus, the repudiation of elders and the generational conflicts which characterized the role of Mujibas in ZANLA operational areas did not take place in ZIPRA operational areas. By operating through the underground party structures, ZIPRA fighters were able to avoid being drawn into local divisions and conflicts, and civilian communities were protected from potential violence or threats from fighters by the party officials, who acted as a kind of protective buffer between unarmed civilians and armed fighters. When difficulties did arise, or on occasions when civilians had cause for complaint, against armed ZIPRA fighters, they had a channel to raise their issues, and this mechanism reached all the way to the senior political leadership if necessary. In this regard, it should be noted that the internal ZAPU party leadership was in regular contact with the exiled leadership. The ZAPU leadership and command structure in exile was headed by the Revolutionary Council, whose membership comprised previously elected members of the ZAPU National Executive Committee and heads of ZAPU departments in exile. Responsibility for planning and supervising the war effort had been ceded to a smaller body, the War Council, comprising 5 permanent members. The ZIPRA and NSO command operated under the supervision of this civilian party structure. It is as a result of these factors that I've outlined that civilians generally suffered far less abuse at the hands of the armed liberation fighters in ZIPRA areas of operation. In some areas, ZIPRA fighters found ZAPU branches already functional and ready to receive and support them. In some areas, ZAPU branches had become defunct or been decimated by arrests and repression. In such cases, ZIPRA commissars worked with local party contacts to resuscitate the party branches. It's clear that the spread of the war and the approach of the ZIPRA guerrillas greatly facilitated the growth of the party branches. But by the same token, the existence of the organized party structures provided important support to the ZIPRA fighters as they moved into new territories. In this way, ZIPRA and ZANLA differ greatly. In addition to immediate local support, the network of underground ZAPU structures provided ZIPRA with vital links into urban centers and across territory controlled by Rhodesian forces. It even crossed borders. ZAPU branches in urban centers provided ZIPRA fighters with important access to supplies, including medicines and clothing, which were not readily available in rural areas. Underground party branches existed in almost all urban centers of Zimbabwe by the later stages of the war, and in many instances, these structures had been deliberately re-established by ZIPRA commissars operating in adjacent rural areas. In several towns and cities, ZIPRA commando and intelligence units had undertaken reconnaissance missions with the assistance of these underground party structures, and had even undertaken several audacious attacks right under the nose of the enemy. As we shall see in the final part of this presentation, it was intended that these underground urban party structures would play a very significant role in the zero-hour operation. This relationship between ZAPU and ZIPRA was not only mutually beneficial to both organizations, but it defined the relationship of ZIPRA with the people and ensured that ZIPRA was a people's army operating under the disciplined guidance of a civilian political party acting in the interests of the people. This type of relationship between a party of liberation and its armed forces did not exist in ZANLA areas of operation, and is unique actually in African liberation history, although some comparisons could be made with the African National Congress in South Africa. The existence of the underground ZAPU political structures certainly had a major influence on the perspectives and behavior of the ZIPRA fighters, in particular in 2 respects. Firstly, in reminding the fighters that they were operating under a political authority and not autonomously. And secondly, in regulating the interaction between armed fighters and unarmed civilians. But this was a 2-way relationship, and the existence and role of the party structures in supporting the armed struggle also provided an organized framework which enabled the civilian population to effectively engage in and support the armed struggle. This gave meaningful content to the phrase People's War and to the claim that ZIPRA was a people's army. In this regard, an important distinction between the 2 historical narratives is that ZANU and ZANLA have tended to identify direct participation in the armed struggle by combatants as the defining characteristic of historical recognition and heroism. In the case of ZAPU, ZIPRA, and in the ZIPRA operational areas, this was not the case. And underground party officials and civilians who supported the war effort, both men and often women, and who displayed great bravery are accorded equal recognition as heroes among the ZIPRA fighters. To illustrate this with an example, ZIPRA Front Commander Andrew Ndlovu, in his account of the war entitled The Delayed Revolution, describes the assassination of Baba Nyati, the local ZAPU district chairman, by Rhodesian forces in Andrew's area of operation. Quote, "He was shot dead in revenge for what he had been doing to support the armed struggle. However, when we, the fighters, heard the news of his death, we observed a moment of silence, and to this day, many amongst us remember him for his outstanding bravery as one of our great heroes." This account illustrates the respect for the civilian contribution to the armed struggle which ZIPRA forces felt, and in which non-competent civilian comrades who displayed outstanding bravery were recognized equally as heroes alongside trained fighters. In this context, ZIPRA forces can be said to have regarded their civilian party comrades as an essential and integral component of the armed struggle and of the People's Army, hence the People's Army. The second area I will now turn to concerns the composition and development of ZIPRA itself. Turning to the composition of ZIPRA, with regard to the notion that ZIPRA was a genuine people's army, I also intend to analyze some elements of the demographic composition of ZIPRA forces to try to understand how this factor impacted on the development of ZIPRA military strategy, which I'll address in the very final part of the presentation. In the first instance, I would argue, as I have in the preceding section, that ZIPRA was a people's army because it was established and operated under the supervision and authority of a people's political party, ZAPU. ZAPU sought the liberation of Zimbabwe and freedom for all its citizens from settler colonialism and imperialism. ZAPU was a political party which sought to mobilize all Zimbabwean citizens to participate in the liberation struggle. Members of ZAPU were, from the outset, recruited from every section of the population and every corner of this country. The leadership of ZAPU throughout the entire history of the liberation struggle can be said to have been truly representative of the people of Zimbabwe, save in one respect only. There were too few women in the leadership. But there were certainly more women in ZAPU's leadership during the struggle than there were in any ZANU leadership. ZIPRA itself reflected these inclusive policies of ZAPU, and participation in ZIPRA was open to all Zimbabweans. Zimbabweans from all corners of this country were to be found in ZIPRA, as was the case in ZAPU itself. This approach of inclusive nationalism, which characterized ZAPU, and in which all those who viewed Zimbabwe as their home were regarded as equal citizens who would have equal rights in a liberated Zimbabwe, was put into practice by ZIPRA and by NSO. My own role in ZIPRA is testimony to this fact. Zimbabweans of Asian origin or mixed race, so-called coloreds, were also to be found in ZIPRA. In this regard, and just as a small digression, it's worth noting that along with black Zimbabweans, Asians, and so-called coloreds, a number of white comrades had participated in ZAPU underground structures and supported the armed struggle in the early 60s. Their role is largely unknown and unrecorded. They included early members of the National Democratic Party, NDP, like Reg Austin, Zimbabwean students John Conradi and Ivan Dixon, who went to prison for smuggling arms of war, and foreign lecturers at the University College of Rhodesia, Giovanni Arrighi, who was captured and deported, and John Reed, who escaped. All these men were members of ZAPU underground cells which smuggled and distributed weapons and hand grenades in the 1960s. A former British soldier, Peter Mackay, played a major role in supporting the armed struggle by transporting ZAPU guerrillas and weapons from Zambia through Botswana for many years. When he died in 2013, there was no official recognition or attention paid to his very important contribution to the armed struggle over many years. And the contribution that was made by the other white comrades I've mentioned is also neglected in our official commemorations. As Debengwa noted, the role of these whites is an inconvenient truth. and our official history can't face inconvenient truths. And that is because the truth reminds us of the non-racial, free, and democratic Zimbabwe we still have to achieve. In my own time in ZIPRA, there were several comrades of Asian origin in our ranks, including Ronnie Patel, Tim Fisher, Krish Ragadu, and so-called colored comrades like Mike Reynolds, Charlie Gray. Several white comrades also served in my own NSO underground and special operation units, operating both inside and outside the country. As Elikim Sibanda has noted in his history of ZAPU, the involvement of whites in the struggle proved to the world that ZAPU clearly defined its struggle as one against an oppressive regime, as opposed to one against whites as a racial group. This definition of the enemy as a colonial system, not a racial or ethnic group, by ZAPU, and the non-racial and democratic vision of a future Zimbabwe advocated by ZAPU, was indeed demonstrated by ZIPRA through its own practice, in contrast to the behavior of ZANU and ZANLA. In this sense, ZIPRA was a people's army, the people being defined as the people of Zimbabwe. The participation of white, colored, and Asian comrades in ZIPRA demonstrates a fundamental difference in ideology and practice between these two parties. And indeed, this has continued to manifest itself in the policies and practice of ZANU in post-independence Zimbabwe. While ZAPU and ZIPRA did not exhibit racial or tribal preferences or prejudices in their conduct of the armed struggle, the geopolitical realities of Zimbabwe did impact on the recruitment patterns and composition of ZIPRA at various stages of the war. Most obviously, very few white Zimbabweans sympathized with or supported the armed struggle, and fewer still actively participated in the liberation struggle. In the second decade of the armed struggle, during the period of ZIPRA's existence, the entire eastern border was inaccessible to ZAPU and to ZIPRA forces. This had an impact on recruitment patterns and options and reduced the number of recruits to ZIPRA from these areas, which were dominated by ZANLA at that time. Increasingly, ZIPRA was confined to recruiting personnel from the main cities and from its own operational areas in Mashonaland West, Midlands, and Matabeleland. Members of ZAPU underground branches and structures in areas occupied by ZANLA forces at this time were hunted down by ZANLA and forced to change allegiance or perish, often being portrayed as sellouts to the local communities. These realities changed the composition of ZIPRA in the final years of the war. It is, however, inaccurate to portray ZIPRA as an Ndebele army or even as an Ndebele-dominated army for a number of reasons. In the first instance, ethnic or tribal identity was never a criterion in recruitment or promotion in ZIPRA. Secondly, ZIPRA articulated a non-racial and non-sectarian ideology and behavior, as directed by the political party ZAPU, which held authority over ZIPRA. Thirdly, and frequently forgotten in most accounts of the Liberation War, ZIPRA's largest military front, the Northern Front, extended mostly over Shona-speaking areas of Zimbabwe. And it was these areas that had the largest concentration of ZIPRA forces in the latter stages of the war. ZIPRA recruitment from these areas continued and largely comprised Shona speakers. Nevertheless, it should be conceded that in the final years of the Liberation War, Ndebele-speaking recruits were disproportionately represented in ZIPRA, not through choice or prejudice, but as a result of geography. Having dealt with this frequently abused and distorted ethnic identification label, I now want to turn to another significant and many respects surprising aspect of the composition of ZIPRA. Firstly, a brief overview just extracted from the survey materials I previously spoke about. By the end of the war, ZIPRA comprised approximately 20,000 persons in all its different manifestations. 50% of these entered ZIPRA training camps in or after 1977, the peak year of entry into ZIPRA. But almost 1/3 of ZIPRA soldiers had entered ZIPRA prior to 1977, and these comprised the veterans. 10% of ZIPRA soldiers were women, mostly incorporated into the ZIPRA Women's Brigade, a conventionally trained infantry unit complete with its own female commanders, engineers, communication, and support services. Like other African liberation armies, ZIPRA was a young person's army, but it was not a children's army. Only 7% of ZIPRA recruits were under 18 when they were trained. 84% of recruits were aged between 18 and 25 years old when they were trained, and 8% were over 26 when they joined. In educational terms, approximately 3/4 of recruits to ZIPRA could be described as functionally literate. And of these, 11% had 10 or more years of education. This is comparatively a very high level of educational capacity and provided the army with a significantly larger number of suitable candidates for higher levels of technical military training than is the case with most African liberation armies. Finally, in terms of demographics, and perhaps most importantly, although 50% of recruits came from peasant households themselves, over 30% of ZIPRA recruits came from urban working class homes. And over half of ZIPRA recruits had themselves been in formal urban wage employment before they were recruited. Significantly, almost 10% of ZIPRA recruits were recruited from South Africa, where they'd been working, mostly recruited through the underground ZAPU networks, which also operated in South Africa. Of particular significance in this regard is the predominance of recruits with experience of modern urban capitalism. Although ZIPRA was rooted in the peasantry through parentage, and many recruits were peasant boys and girls, ZIPRA was unusually urban and proletarian in composition. This is a very significant feature, and combined with the high educational standards, provided ZIPRA with recruits who had unusually high levels of technical capacity and experience of modern wage labor, trade unionism, and political organization, which were absent from other liberation armies and notably absent from ZANLA. These proletarian characteristics of the ZIPRA recruits also reflect a more general dynamic of the split in the nationalist movement dating back to 1963. When ZANU was formed, none of the working class or trade union leadership supported the ZANU split, and they remained loyal to and aligned with Dr. Nkomo and ZAPU. Broadly speaking, and throughout the following decade and a half of armed struggle, the trade union leadership and the working class movement as a whole remained aligned with ZAPU. Thus, while ZIPRA attracted recruits from working class backgrounds, ZANLA was, throughout its existence, essentially a peasant-based army, without any significant working class participation. ZANU, which had originally been described as the Teachers' Revolt in 1963, attracted intellectuals in the mid-70s, but it never seriously attracted working class support. In many ways, ZANU's post-independence policies continue to reflect this orientation: hostility to the urban working class and dependence on the rural peasantry. Returning to the composition of ZIPRA, in broad terms, we can say ZIPRA recruits were older and better educated on average than their counterparts in ZANLA. Most of them had been members of underground political structures and therefore had unusually high levels of political experience and maturity. And finally, most of the ZIPRA recruits were proletarian rather than peasant in orientation, having experienced urban wage employment, many of them in South Africa. This, in African Liberation Army terms, is a very unusual mix of recruits. Before turning finally to the development of ZIPRA military strategy, I should like to make a generalized summary of the implications of the circumstances, background, and demographics I have just outlined, specifically with regard to the opportunities and challenges these realities reflected in determining the strategic options in the Liberation War. Essentially, ZIPRA recruits appear to have been actively recruited rather than pushed by economic or geographic factors. And they were recruited from communities in which the Party of Liberation, ZAPU, was present and active. And they themselves were the product of a politically mobilized and active population. Most ZIPRA recruits had themselves been active members of underground political structures before joining the army. They were relatively well educated, and the majority of them had been exposed to urban proletarian life and to the modernizing experience of exploitative capitalist wage labor. Many had been active in trade unions or labor organizations of some sort, and had been exposed to aspects of class-based ideology and politics, as well as the racist oppression all black people suffered and the national liberation politics it provoked. In all these contexts, it's apparent that ZIPRA differed markedly from ZANLA, and it is therefore not surprising that these two armies behaved differently in the field, developed different characteristics, especially with regard to their relationship to unarmed civilian communities, and finally developed very different military strategies. It's to the latter issue that I will now turn in concluding this presentation. So, the development of ZIPRA military strategy. Between 1970 and 1971, ZAPU suffered from a debilitating internal crisis, whose content and process lie outside our scope today. Suffice it to say that, in part, the self-critical evaluation exercise which ZAPU undertook in 1970 to reflect on its past military efforts and strategy triggered serious internal divisions and led to a three-way split in the party. A number of senior ZAPU military figures left ZAPU and joined ZANLA at this time, providing ZANLA with significant reinforcements and invaluable experience and information, most notably from the northeastern part of the country where the ZAPU MK pyramid detachment had recently been operating. That, of course, was the same area that ZANLA commenced its military operations shortly thereafter. And ZAPU also lost its important strategic contact and alliance with Frelimo at this time of crisis. Following the split in ZAPU, a week-long consultative meeting was called by JZ Moya, at which a revolutionary council was established to lead the national liberation struggle, and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, was formed to carry out the military strategy of ZAPU. Following these developments, the newly established ZIPRA command resumed armed action. Early operations in 1972 and 1973 were largely confined to border areas and concentrated on sabotage, landmine, and ambush warfare, designed to engage and extend enemy forces along a broad front. These operations were conducted by a relatively small but highly effective and energetic group of veteran fighters who successfully ambushed, harassed, and stretched enemy forces along the entire Zambezi Gorge and riverfront. These operations were accompanied by retraining, recruitment, and reorganization of ZIPRA forces at rear bases in preparation for an extension of military action deeper into the country. Significant progress had been achieved by ZIPRA in all these endeavors when, in 1974, the détente process was launched, involving the United States, its allies in apartheid South Africa, and accompanied by efforts in the frontline states to develop a united approach and leadership within the Zimbabwean nationalist movement. These developments disrupted ZIPRA plans to escalate the armed struggle. ZANU was itself in deep crisis at this time, and most of the ZANLA command were imprisoned in Zambia following the murder of ZANU chairperson Herbert Chitepo. The armed struggle therefore came to a halt on all fronts. Whilst various processes involving potential negotiations and unity arrangements among the nationalist leadership faltered and dragged on over the following months, some elements in the frontline states, most obviously initially Mozambique and then Tanzania, began pushing hard to establish a new format for unity, involving a common military formation and leadership, involving both ZIPRA and ZANLA. This formation, known as the Zimbabwe People's Army, ZIPRA, came into existence in November 1975. As the ZIPRA component in ZIPRA played little role in either developing ZIPRA military strategy or, in fact, in restarting the war under ZIPRA auspices, I propose to avoid this particular period of ZIPRA history and move directly ahead to ZIPRA's own internal efforts to recommence the armed struggle. Following the withdrawal of ZIPRA from ZIPA in Mozambique, ZIPRA forces relocated to their bases in Zambia and essentially picked up the armed struggle from the same point of departure where they had left it in 1973. The strategy, as before, involved ambush and landmine warfare over a large front along the entire Zambezi River, intending to attenuate the enemy forces and avoiding direct combat except in circumstances where the guerrilla forces had overwhelming advantage. With increased numbers of fighters and building on the experiences and skills gained by veteran fighters in the previous round of conflict, this strategy enabled ZIPRA to make significant progress, and most importantly, to drive the Rhodesian forces out of their small posts along the Zambezi River and back over the escarpment into more defensible garrisons. This enabled ZIPRA forces to move past the unpopulated Zambezi Gorge and finally reach vital sanctuaries offered in populated areas further inland without having to fight every inch of the way. The strategy remained one of mobile guerrilla warfare based on mine warfare, raids, and ambushes, where ZIPRA forces aimed to strike unexpectedly and withdraw, and by repeating this hit-and-run warfare to stretch, weaken, and exhaust the enemy forces. The ZIPRA political commissar for Urungwe, Jerry Mtetwa, describes the process and progress at that time as follows. The enemy was very much affected, especially by mine warfare. They could not move by truck. They also had to move on foot. And when they moved on foot, it was easier for us. Then maybe we would put a grenade on their observation post. When they go to that observation post, it blasts them. Then they fear using their observation posts. We cut the enemy supplies by ambushing supply trucks and mining roads. By doing so, we were starving the enemy soldiers. As a result, they had to retreat, going to bigger camps and tarred roads. They would only come into our areas now for operations. From that time, our troops started going deeper into the country. Let's say the enemy is based here. We would then deploy another unit beyond to start operating behind the enemy. That's when the enemy was disrupted. That made it easier again for us to move on. That's when the enemy started retreating. That's when we were free in the tribal trust lands. This penetration of the rural hinterland marked the real breakthrough for ZIPRA forces, and during 1977, they pressed home the advantage, infiltrating several hundred guerrillas and rapidly extending their operational areas. Todd Mpisi, Deputy Regional Commander in the Zambezi Wankie area, describes the progress he made having opened operations in that area with 9 guerrillas. Quote, our unit grew so rapidly that within 5 months, we were over 400 comrades in that area. This was the most successful campaign I experienced in the whole of the struggle. We had very few casualties. We moved in small units unless we planned to hit bigger targets. We lost only 12 men, of which more than half were lost capsizing in the river crossing. In action, we lost very few men. Enemy casualties counted were 32, but it should be more. They lost a lot of men. By this stage of the war, ZIPRA guerrillas were operating in a wide arc of Rhodesia, from Sipililo and Urungwe in the north, through Gokwe and Silabella into the center of the country, and from Kariba and Victoria Falls into Lupani, Nkai, and Chilocho in the west. These operational areas comprised the ZIPRA Northern Front, divided into 3 sectors. Guerrilla units had also crossed the Salisbury-Bulawayo railway line and opened the Southern Front, operating towards Shabani, Gwanda, and Beitbridge. In most of the ZIPRA Northern Front, the Rhodesians had been driven back into larger, more easily defended garrisons by the guerrilla forces and had abandoned their previous strategy of mobile counteroffensive, opting instead for a new strategy based on area defense. In effect, the Rhodesians were conceding territory to guerrilla control, and the first liberated and semi-liberated areas came into being. ZIPRA had already taken a decision to train and develop some conventional forces. These forces were now available, and ZIPRA was able to deploy the first of them to reinforce guerrilla units in early 1978. This capacity provided ZIPRA with greater firepower in mounting attacks against the larger garrisons and enabled ZIPRA to defend liberated and semi-liberated territory for the first time. Artillery weapons such as the 105mm B-10s and the 82mm mortars greatly increased the offensive capabilities of the reinforced guerrilla detachments. Anti-aircraft units equipped with ZEGU and anti-aircraft cannon and SAM missiles were also deployed to provide the larger consolidated guerrilla detachments with an air defense capacity. At this point, ZIPRA was moving towards the next and higher stage of guerrilla warfare. what the renowned Vietnamese practitioner and theorist of revolutionary war, General Giap, called mobile warfare. This progress was also being experienced by Zanla at that time, and they were also congregating larger forces and making use of heavier caliber weaponry. ZIPRA and Zanla were making similar progress at this time, along very similar trajectories, which simply reflected the basic shift in the balance of forces in the field. It was at this point, however, that ZIPRA and the ZAPU War Council made a key decision, which distinguishes the ZIPRA military strategy as unique amongst all African liberation movements. No African liberation movement has actually seized power from a colonial power. As a rule, African independence, even following violent or armed action, was preceded by negotiations in which the colonial power was able to construct various conditionalities which restrained transformation. In large measure, this is because no African liberation movement has established either the military capacity or the strategy which would enable it to defeat the colonial power. They have instead built guerrilla armies and strategies which were able to create sufficient pressure to force negotiations. ZIPRA is the only liberation army which made a serious attempt to build both the military capabilities and to develop the strategy which could have enabled an African liberation movement to actually defeat the enemy in battle and seize power on its own terms. ZIPRA was actually intending to use mobile warfare as a precursor and preparation for inflicting military defeat on the enemy and seizing power by military means. And herein lies its singularity. These developments, which had been triggered by discussions following circulation of a document entitled Our Path to Liberation, authored by J.Z. Moyo in late 1976, shortly before his assassination, focused attention on the need for ZAPU to develop a specific military strategy aimed at seizing power through armed struggle. Our Path to Liberation had been presented to an internal ZAPU and ZIPRA consultative conference, the second conference of militants, as it was called, and shortly after the failure of the Geneva talks. Our Path to Liberation was a seminal document in the evolution of ZIPRA military strategy, and in my mind, it remains even today one of the most significant evocations and assessments of liberation strategy and prospects for revolutionary transformation. I don't have time today to do more than draw attention to its key observations as they relate to the topic under consideration. So here they were. In the first place, they asked the critical question of what indeed and precisely was the political objective of the liberation movement in Zimbabwe. The second observation was a critical warning that the nationalist leadership in Zimbabwe, comprising as it did a relatively large number of what Moyo called petty bourgeois aspirants and compradors, posed a major threat to meaningful liberation transformation. And thirdly, Our Path to Liberation warned that the negotiations then underway at the Geneva Conference and negotiations in general were aimed at installing, quote, an interim African caretaker for imperialist interests in an effort to prevent genuine independence and the transfer of power to the people. Party strategy, therefore, Moyo argued, should be geared to defeating attempts to prevent genuine independence. And his solution was stated simply as follows: the only way to ensure the genuine independence of our country is to conquer state power. The objective is power to the people. This objective cannot be realized unless the liberation forces of Zimbabwe seize state power. As Dumiso Debengwa, who was a key figure in those deliberations, later recalled, quote, we were talking about seizing power. When we looked at other guerrilla wars, we could see that guerrilla warfare does not enable you to seize power. It only creates the conditions for other forces to settle the question. We wanted to take it a step further than that and prepare ourselves to develop a military strategy and gear it to the final goal of military victory. We felt that guerrilla warfare on its own could not achieve that. The deliberations on military strategy, which were provoked by our path to liberation, led ZIPRA to decide to divert recruits to conventional military training courses. And this enabled ZIPRA to introduce heavier weapons and conventionally trained soldiers into the war by early 1978. ZIPRA was now able not simply to occupy more territory, but to attack larger enemy formations and strategic sites. Then, in late 1978, ZIPRA convened a high command for a very important conference to assess progress in the war and to discuss what became known as the Turning Point strategy. The Turning Point Conference in November 1978, building on the military strategy developed after our path to liberation discussions 2 years earlier, and noting that the Rhodesian forces had now lost control in many parts of rural Zimbabwe, set two major military objectives. The first objective was to consolidate the gains of the guerrilla forces by enabling ZIPRA to defend liberated areas. The second objective was to enable ZIPRA forces to mount large-scale operations and attacks on larger Rhodesian garrisons and military formations. These objectives were to be achieved through the introduction of significant numbers of regular forces and heavy weaponry into the country, the reorganization of smaller guerrilla units, I beg your pardon, just one moment as I've lost my note. There we go. These objectives were to be achieved through the introduction of significant numbers of regular forces and heavy weaponry into the country, the reorganization of the smaller guerrilla units into larger detachments and brigades, incorporating regular units, and the strengthening of the command structures and the transfer of almost half the high command into the country, and the preparation of regional offensive plans to be implemented by the respective front commanders. But more significantly, and in the greatest secrecy, the Turning Point strategy was fundamentally intended to create the conditions for the launching of a major strategic offensive to inflict a military defeat on the Rhodesian military and to end the war. Immediately following the decisions of the Turning Point Conference, a small team of ZIPRA and NSO officers began making final plans for this strategic offensive. Their plan was called the 0 Hour Operation, and its details were the most closely guarded secret ZAPU held during the Liberation War. Previous attempts by outsiders, including academic researchers, to explain 0 Hour have erroneously described it either as a conventional military offensive ascribed its design and content to Soviet advisors, or they have claimed that it was a secret attempt to hold back ZIPRA forces in order to attack Zanla after independence. Both these views are totally untrue. The reality is that the Soviet military advisors were not responsible for any of the planning of the 0 Hour. It was developed entirely by NSO and ZIPRA, and nor were they initially convinced that the plan could work. The commonplace description of the 0 Hour plan as an Ethiopian-type Warsaw Pact invasion is also nonsense. Formulations such as these are neither useful nor accurate, although they do illustrate how ideological tags were used in the disinformation campaigns mounted against ZAPU and ZIPRA at that time. Our plans were in fact far more comprehensive and innovative than has been supposed. And today I'm going to unpack some briefly of the details of the 0 Hour plan. The broad concept of the 0 Hour plan comprised 4 major components of a coordinated series of offensives to be launched simultaneously. The first component involved 5 conventional battalions with artillery and engineering support, which were required to seize bridgeheads along the Zambezi River at Kanyamba, Chirundu, and Kariba. Reinforced brigades already inside the country were to support these efforts by launching attacks on Kariba, Victoria Falls, and Wankie, taking control of the airfields. The principal objectives of the attacks in this component was to enable ZIPRA to establish strategic rear bases on the Rhodesian side of the border in support of the second component of the plan, which involved a series of offensives into the heart of the country. The second component of the plan involved offensives to be launched by the newly reinforced brigades already located inside the country, along several simultaneous lines of advance. In the north, the attacks were aimed at Karoi and Sonoya. In the Midlands, the brigade based in Gokwe was to attack Kwekwe and then move north to attack Hartley. The brigade based in Lamagundi was to advance on Gatuma and Salisbury, whilst the brigade in Sipalilo was to concentrate its efforts towards Mvukwe's and Mount Darwin. The brigade based in Inkai was to attack Gwelu. The brigade based in Chilocho had the task of advancing to attack Bulawayo. In the southern front, there were 3 lines of advance towards Plumtree, Kezi, and Gwanda. In each area, strategic targets were to be attacked and captured, including military garrisons and police posts, railway stations, fuel supplies, and depots. The third component of the zero-hour plan comprised 2 elements. The first involved specialized commando and sabotage units already located in or near urban areas, which were to launch a simultaneous wave of ambushes and attacks behind enemy lines in the key urban centers, aimed at disrupting efforts by the Rhodesians to respond to the major offensives launched by the regular ZIPRA forces and the reinforced brigades. The military bases and airfields in Salisbury, Bulawayo, and Gwelo were priority targets. The second element involved locally trained ZAPU Youth League members establishing local militia units, which were to support the commando and sabotage units and reinforced brigades, and to provide community security. Training of these local ZAPU militia forces was already underway inside the country, and large quantities of small arms had been cached around the country for this purpose. The fourth and final component of the zero-hour plan involved the underground ZAPU party branches throughout the country, who were to trigger and stimulate local civilian uprisings in support of all the major military offensives. The zero-hour plan, based on these simultaneous offensives, attacks, and uprisings across the country, was intended to overwhelm the enemy, who would simply be unable to respond on so many fronts at once. It was anticipated that in the first 24 hours of zero hour, several dozen simultaneous offensives, attacks, and assaults would take place across the country, in contrast to the average of 3 or 4 daily combat-related incidents, which were taking place at that time. Finally, of course, we expected ZANLA to join the assaults in their operational areas, taking advantage of the chaos created by the ZIPRA multi-pronged offensives. They were, however, not to be informed of the plans until the very last minute, as we suspected that the Rhodesian informers and foreign agents in their leadership and high command would reveal our intentions. For the same reason, no one outside the War Council and the small teams working on planning in NSO and ZIPRA had detailed knowledge of the zero-hour plans or the timing. Front commanders and unit commanders each had appropriate knowledge of the preparations needed for their own specific missions, but not of the overall plan. Overall responsibility for the zero-hour operation obviously fell under the overall supervision of the most senior ZAPU leadership. But for security reasons, very few in the ZAPU leadership were aware of the existence of the zero-hour plan. The ZAPU leadership and command structure in exile at that time was headed by the Revolutionary Council, as I've said, whose members comprised previously elected members of the ZAPU National Executive Committee and heads of ZAPU departments in exile. This body had ceded the responsibility for strategic policy and planning of the war effort to a much smaller body, the War Council, comprising only 5 permanent members. These were the President of ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, the ZAPU Commissar, Samuel Munodawata, the Secretary for Defense, Akim Ndlovu, the ZIPRA Commander, Lookout Masuku, and the head of NSO, Dumiso Debengwa, who also served as the War Council Secretary. The ZIPRA High Command at this time comprised the ZIPRA Commander and his deputies, chiefs and deputies of ZIPRA departments, front commanders and their deputies, rear base commanders, and NSO heads of directorates and their deputies. In addition to the direct intelligence and security functions which NSO provided to the War Council, essentially strategic intelligence briefings for consideration by the War Council in determining politico-military strategy, NSO also developed overall strategic options and conducted some of the detailed planning for the zero-hour plan. In the midst of this planning process, Commonwealth heads of state assembled in Lusaka on the 1st of July 1979, and Mrs. Thatcher famously danced with President Kaunda at a State House banquet. Until this point, most commentators believed that the British Conservative government would continue its policy of enabling and clandestinely supporting the internal settlement, in which Ian Smith had engaged Bishop Muzorewa and others in the comical but tragic charade of a country with a surname, Zimbabwe Rhodesia. The Patriotic Front, comprising ZAPU and ZANU, had been vilified up to that point as communist terrorists, and the leadership in the United States and the United Kingdom had declared ZAPU in particular as a proxy for the Soviet Union, who the Western world regarded as its global strategic opponent during that period of history. Overnight, their stance changed, and the Patriotic Front were invited to attend a new negotiation initiative to be hosted by Britain, who apparently now accepted their obligations as the colonial power in Rhodesia. The Lancaster House conference was scheduled to open in mid-September, and suddenly we had to prepare to face our opponents on two fronts. The final offensive planned in the zero-hour operation on the one hand, and negotiations on the other. Our own assessment was that the shift to a negotiation strategy by the British was based on an appraisal of realities on the battlefield and a recognition that the Rhodesian army was actually now in danger of being militarily defeated by ZIPRA. As we were well aware of the content and the implications of the zero-hour operation, in particular its objective of ending the war in one final series of military major offensives, we had to assume that the British had some knowledge of our plans, or at least, and more certainly, that they'd been monitoring the build-up and deployment of our forces and armaments, and had drawn their own conclusions. On this basis, we believed that negotiations were a preemptive effort designed to rescue the Rhodesians from a military defeat. The question we asked ourselves in this regard was what alternative they had in mind and how we could maneuver through this new terrain and still achieve our goals through negotiation. J.Z. Moyo's warnings in our path to liberation weighed heavily on us at that time. I was deployed to Lancaster House as part of the NSO technical support team. And when Dumiso Debengwa arrived in London, he provided me with an even more worrying assessment, based in part on information he had received during a stopover in Moscow. The view of our Soviet advisors was, according to Debengwa, that this shift in strategy was almost certainly based on some knowledge of the zero-hour plan, and moreover, that the Western powers were determined to prevent another Angolan scenario, where Cuban intervention and support from socialist countries had rescued the MPLA from a military invasion by apartheid forces and Western mercenaries, and enabled Angola to declare independence and to score a decisive victory against apartheid South Africa and the Western-funded puppet movements in Angola. The Soviet view was that the West was now focused on addressing the strategic risk posed to apartheid South Africa, and had already conceded independence of some sort for Rhodesia, provided only that the new regime in Zimbabwe was anti-Soviet. The Western world's primary strategic enemy at the time was the Soviet Union, and those countries and forces deemed to be allies of the Soviet Union. These were the enemies that needed to be dealt with. The support we in ZIPRA and ZAPU had received from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, and our long-standing alliance with the African National Congress and close collaboration with its armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, made us the immediate and obvious target. As Debengwa related the somber assessment, he concluded by telling me that the Soviets believed that if ZAPU went to Lancaster House, the liberation project for Zimbabwe would be over and ZIPRA would be annihilated. A short final conclusion. Throughout the period of conference deliberations, the ZAPU War Council representatives at Lancaster House wrestled with the decision of whether to launch 0 hour or elements of it and seize the initiative. The prevailing view in the NSO command and indeed in the ZIPRA command as a whole was in favor of proceeding with 0 hour. The political leadership, including Joshua Nkomo himself, were hesitant, persuasively drawing attention to the heavy loss of life which would be involved, and relating to us their own political discussions with friend and foe alike, drawing our attention to the major regional and international political implications and risks. A typical summary of the political risks as presented by the ZAPU leadership to us could be represented as follows, quote, "We will be portrayed as aggressors who do not want peace. Our regional allies will be compromised and will have to denounce us. And worse still, the operation will be blamed on the Soviets, and that may well create conditions for direct intervention by the apartheid regime and its Western allies." Sometimes there are no good choices, only the choice between bad and worse. Despite our serious concerns, our leaders had to make tough choices, and in the end, they chose to halt the 0 hour operation and direct their efforts towards securing an agreement at Lancaster House, and then relying on everyone to implement it in good faith. Once the Patriotic Front leaders signed the Lancaster House agreement, the die was cast. In terms of the agreement, ZIPRA forces now fell under the command and authority of the British Governor, Lord Soames. And when they entered the assembly points, they effectively surrendered. From that moment, they ceased to be a people's army and became instead captured by, and in very, very many cases, victims of the neo-colonial project implemented by Robert Mugabe and the compliant ZANU leadership on behalf of imperialism after independence on 18 April 1980. In conclusion, it seems that J.Z. Moyo's observations in Our Path to Liberation were prophetic, and his fear of negotiations proved to be well-founded. ZIPRA's efforts to create conditions in which the liberation movement might determine its own post-independence agenda and undertake a radical and meaningful transformation process in which power was actually transferred to the people ultimately failed. But in its determined efforts to wage a liberation war, and particularly through its courageous attempt to seize power from settler colonialism and imperialism by military means, ZIPRA certainly displayed the behavior of a truly determined and revolutionary people's army. This is what I believe our history should say about ZIPRA. And these events and experiences illustrate, I think, some of the important lessons future generations should learn and learn from in their own quest to achieve genuine freedom. Zenzele, thank you. I'll conclude there.
Wow, that was quite an interesting history lesson. I saw someone commenting here that when they get home, they're going to throw away their history books because they think that they don't reflect the true history. So this was quite intense. Within an hour, you actually summarized and probably answered most of the questions on the question, but why did ZIPRA lose? And clearly it's because at the end of the day, it came to negotiation. And of course, when you're negotiating, someone wins. So like you said, sometimes, you know, the choice is between bad and worse, or so you just have no good choice. I'm just trying to check whether there are any questions here, but a lot of people were actually following. There's someone who asked whether I think this person was once asked me and I couldn't find anything. Do you know anything about something called the Chinyanzura or something like that?
No, I'm afraid that doesn't ring a bell with me. It doesn't mean it wasn't there, but I've only reflected what I have known myself and been part of.
Yeah, because I also tried to look around. I have never come across the way. I had it, but I can't remember what it was all about. But everyone seems to agree this was brilliant, well presented. I don't seem to get any questions. I had questions on 0 hour, you answered them. I had questions on why you think, but This is my question. Looking back, where do you think ZIPRA would have done better? Any regrets?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Zenzeli, because with the benefit of hindsight, we could have done everything better. But I think if one looks at the actual process and how it unraveled, and in particular, how comrades began to tackle what was the critical question that JZ Moyo put in front of us, namely, what is the political objective of the liberation struggle? Is it to give power to a new petty bourgeois elite who will establish a black capitalist comprador transformation, such as we currently have achieved? If that was the objective, well, then that was the objective. But I can assure you that was not the objective that the vast majority of fighters had in mind. There was certainly a common understanding and belief in a far more radical transformation involving transfer of power to the people. And that's why I would argue and have argued in relation to the topic that ZIPRA performed its role as a people's army to the best of its ability and capacity. But we were caught in a trap from which there was no escape. I gave that summary, and Joshua, when he briefed us in Lancaster House, put it exactly like that. When we are offered the chance to negotiate peace, we can't launch an offensive, gentlemen, without being called warmongers. Kaunda will have to denounce us. He'll have to close our bases. We will be accused of being ZIPRA pawns. So we had no possibility of moving forward militarily despite the preparations. So that central issue of what could we have done to alter the overall trajectory, I think we did the best we could and were basically trapped by more powerful forces.
I have two questions. The first one is, what was ZIPRA's view on ZAPU joining ZANU in the unit accord and supporting the one-party state?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, which goes all the way back to previous efforts that were made, the attempt to set up the Joint Military Command in the early 70s, the attempt to set up a ZIPRA. And in all these cases, I think in general terms, certainly as I came across it, we were always strongly in favor of unity. But I have to concede that we were deeply suspicious of the motivations of some of the ZANU political leadership. And this for me was borne out when Mugabe essentially destroyed the progressive leadership of ZIPRA in 1977 and removed the pro-unity forces from the ZANU command and brought in the anti-unity and more reactionary nationalist leadership, which eventually came into government in 1980. So I think our view was nuanced. I think we wanted unity. We were certainly committed to the patriotic front as a process, but I have to concede that we were deeply suspicious of the motives of the nationalist leadership in ZANU and their project. And their project, was their project a transfer of power to the people? I think not. And in general, in ZIPRA, I think our project was transfer of power to the people and a radical and socialist-oriented transformation of Zimbabwe. And that was common in ZIPRA, to come across that view.
Another question here, I think we have tried to, we've talked this before, I think, and I've asked a lot of people. There is the issue of the bombing of the oil tanks in Harare. I mean, ZANLA is claiming it, ZIPRA is claiming it. And recently I talked to someone who said, no, it was not ZANLA, it was not ZIPRA, it was the Mozambicans. I mean, so what's the story?
You know, Zenzeli, I can tell you about operations I participated in because I know about them, but I'm not going to be drawn into conjecture about an operation I did not participate in. I knew there were commando units in Salisbury. I had my own units in Salisbury, but they did not attack the oil tank, my own unit. And I don't have direct knowledge of that operation. So I only know what comrades have said about it, and that's contested. So I'm not going to repeat that. I'm unable to help you on that one. I know what we did when I participated in it, and I'm not going to have a contest over operations that I have no direct knowledge of. So regrettably, I can't provide you with an answer.
The last one, the last question that I have here. A lot of people are asking, are you writing a book?
Funnily enough, I have already written a large part of that book. So the answer is yes. And those of us who have this knowledge and our own perspectives and who participated in the liberation struggle, of course, have a big responsibility to provide the younger generation, with whatever our own perspectives are. My perspective is my personal perspective. It's what I know in my own analysis. It's not the whole history. It's just what I saw or did. And the accounts from many of us who participated to achieve a genuine history. But yes, I'm busy on my part of it.
Yeah, I said the last one. This would be the last one now, I promise. There's a question here that says, what do you think about the fact that at the moment, the apex of the current leadership of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, including ZDF, is led by, ex-ZIPRA?
I think I ended my comments by talking about how ZIPRA ceased to exist. We surrendered when we entered the assembly points, and we certainly didn't exist after we were disarmed in 1981. So those people who are currently in the ZNA are, to my mind, in the command. They were in ZIPRA for 3, 4, 5 years, but they've been in the ZNA for 35 years. So I don't think you can call them ZIPRA. I think you have to call them what they are. They are the ZNA. They may have had an origin in ZIPRA, and it, I hope, helped develop their capabilities. But I don't think you can ascribe any of their responsibility or behavior to ZIPRA, because they've been for 35, 40 years not in ZIPRA. They've been under a totally different influence, involved in a very different construction of politics under a reactionary nationalist regime, which is essentially building a black capitalist comprador power structure in this country. And they are the armed forces of that ruling class. And that ruling class is not the ruling class that the ZIPRA forces of the 70s believed they were going to achieve. So I don't see them as being ZIPRA, and I don't see their behavior as representing anything that we believed in the 70s. They are the instruments of a new ruling class, and they have been for many years. I don't think you should expect much more from them than what you're seeing.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. I know we might have all sorts of questions, and time does not allow us to answer everything, but I'm excited that you're saying you're writing a book, because at the end of the day, history has to be recorded, and we're looking forward to reading a book and hosting you on this platform. Sorry, bit of sneezing there. These days when you sneeze around, people run away from you. So
I'm very pleased that I made you sneeze, Zenzele, because this means you have listened to me very carefully and it's being sneezed now. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope I've made a small contribution to people's understanding of a complex and contested history which we still need to recover. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And those who joined us late or in the middle, we were talking to Jeremy Brickhill, and the topic of the day was ZIPRA, the People's Army. Quite an exciting presentation. This presentation will be available on our Facebook page. It will also be available on YouTube, so you can download, you can watch, you can just share it, and of course don't forget to like our page. If you are here, like our page, Site ZW. Also follow us on Twitter at Site CITZW. We want to have as many of you following our work as possible, sharing it, and thank you very much for the support. These public lectures have always been informative, and we hope to host more and get the history of Zimbabwe. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Siyabonga. for your time. Until we meet again in another public lecture, have a good day. And before I leave, I just want to remind people that on Friday on this platform again, we'll be launching a documentary called I Want My Virginity Back, stories of rape during Kukuraundi. Quite a moving documentary that talks about rape during Kukuraundi, how women were raped, how they are suffering, so many kids that were born then and are still having problems now. So do join us on Friday for this documentary launch. For now, have a good day.